Zoom because we are also live streaming. So that means others are watching us on live stream. I think we're using, what are we using? YouTube. We're using
YouTube.
the YouTube channel. We have our own. And then of course it will be recorded. So this one will also be how shall we put it? This can be rewatched, right? It can be replayed. So I'll start to welcome the people, and then I'll call the two coordinators of our School of Diplomacy, and then one of them will introduce the moderator, and then the moderator will introduce you. Okay. So to start with, good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure really to be in this conversation, as we call it. It's not a webinar. We'd rather call it a conversation so that we can talk openly about issues with the Ambassador of India to the Philippines, His Excellency Shambhu Kumaran. And of course, we have our school for global affairs and diplomacy, and we started this just last year because we saw the need for more training in diplomacy. And we also introduced a new strand, humanitarian diplomacy, knowing that there's so many things happening right now in the world. In fact, we're looking at Myanmar. It's a humanitarian issue now. It's also humanitarian diplomacy issue for us and other places in the world. But for all of those are watching us, you know that India is a big player in the Indo-Pacific region, and I'm glad that I met the ambassador face to face during the COVID. When he laid a wreath before the statue of Mahatma Gandhi. For those of you who don't know yet, we have a statue of the great one of Mahatma Gandhi in our campus. It is a gift from the government of India. It was brought there really by the president of India himself. And what I understand is that there are only 4 such statues all over the world, and we are one of the lucky recipients because of our own Center for Peace Education, and also because we, as a women's college, we are really working for not only peace in the region or in the world, but also peace in our own family. So having completed my welcome, may I call my two coordinators for the School of Diplomacy. One is in charge of humanitarian diplomacy, and the other one is for political and economic diplomacy, Dr. Miguel Darotan and Dr. Jed Rabena. And then Jed will introduce the moderator. Okay, guys, please introduce yourself briefly, Migs and Jed.
Morning, everyone, and good morning, Ambassador Rotan, and welcome to the Diplomatic Hour. As the former Ambassador Laura de Rosario said, that this is a candid conversation that we launched as part of the Bachelor of Arts in Global Affairs new program under the Miriam College. We welcome you, Ambassador, and we hope that we have a candid and also a very fruitful discussion this morning. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Dula, ma'am, and namaste to Ambassador Kumaran, sir. Thank you for being with us. So to proceed, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this morning. Our moderator is Professor Lucio Blanco Pitio III. He is my colleague. He's a research fellow at the Asia-Pacific Pathways Progress Foundation, a foreign policy think tank. He also sits as a member of the board of directors of the Philippine Association for Chinese Studies. He was a lecturer at the Chinese Studies program of the Ateneo de Manila University and the International Studies Department of De La Salle University. He obtained his Master of Laws from Peking University and is presently pursuing his MA in International Affairs, that's his second, at the American University in Washington, D.C. He is also a well-published scholar. Some of his works have appeared at the National Interest, The Diplomat, Nikkei Asia Review, Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, among many others. So without further ado, I'd like to call on our moderator, Professor Pitlo. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Jed Rabena, for the very generous introduction. Good morning to everyone. Of course, good morning, Ambassador Shambhu Kumaran. It's a great pleasure to serve as the host for this third iteration of Miriam College Diplomatic Hour. Ambassador Lula del Rosario, thank you for the kind invitation. And this morning, we would be discussing a very interesting subject, of course. And of course, we know that India is a major player in the region, uh, major donor in this pandemic. Of course, we thank India for providing access to vaccines for not only to Philippines but also to other countries, providing medical assistance at the time of this great unprecedented global health crisis. And of course, we also stand in solidarity with the people of India at this difficult time. And of course, our well wishes, our best prayers are for the speedy recovery and of course the turnaround of India. We are very confident that in no time soon, everything will be back to normal. So let me introduce our great speaker this morning, uh, Mr. Shambhu S. Kumaran. He's a very accomplished and seasoned diplomat. He joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1995. His diplomatic assignments abroad include postings in Frankfurt and Berlin, as political counselor in Kathmandu, and as Deputy High Commissioner to South Africa. At headquarters, he was Deputy Secretary of West Europe Division, handling relations with the United Kingdom, Germany, Spain, as well as the Commonwealth from 2002 to 2004. He was officer on special duty at press relations in the External Publicity Division from 2004 to 2007. From 2012 to 2016, he was Director, East Asia and China, Joint Secretary Establishment, and Joint Secretary of Eurasia in the Ministry of External Affairs of India. During January 2016 to May 2019, he was on deputation to the Ministry of Defense as Joint Secretary for Planning and International Cooperation. He was the Ambassador of India to the Kingdom of Morocco from June 2019 to July 2020. He holds a bachelor's degree in English literature from Kerala University, as well as an MA in International Studies and Master of Philosophy in Diplomatic Studies from Jawaharlal Nehru University, India's best, in New Delhi. Without further ado, it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker this morning to share with us, of course, India's foreign and national security policy and its far-reaching implications, not only to the Philippines, not only to Southeast Asia, but to the broader Asia and Indo-Pacific. Allow me the pleasure. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Ambassador Shambhu Kumaran. Sir.
Thank you very much, Professor Pitlow. Great pleasure to meet all of you. I'd like to begin by thanking Ambassador Laura del Rosario, President of the Miriam College, for this opportunity. And it is indeed a great pleasure to be speaking to some of the accomplished and some of the to-be accomplished minds on foreign policy in the Philippines. So I'm very glad to have this occasion where I can exchange some thoughts with some of the young minds in the Philippines who are interested in foreign and security matters in particular. So I look forward very much to this discussion. Thank you also, Professor Pitlow, for your kind words on the COVID situation in India. I'm very happy to inform you that the situation is improving quite rapidly. We did have a fairly vicious second wave, which came up rather unexpectedly, reflecting the fact that we still don't know enough about the virus and the way in which it works. We were briefly challenged in addressing the upsurge, but with a combination of various policy measures and efforts at different levels, especially by our very brave healthcare workers and a range of other important actors, we've managed to cap and now roll back the number of infections. But we really appreciate the solidarity and support of friends across the world, and including in the Philippines. So I'm really grateful that you brought it up. And of course, we will continue to work in the future, as we've done in the past, to be a reliable and trustworthy partner, especially for countries in the developing world, in addressing the healthcare needs. And India's pharmaceutical industry and our vaccine industry will continue to be an asset to our partners in the days to come. Today, I have a subject with a very broad sweep. And of course, it's a subject that is witnessing a lot of interesting and dynamic changes. We are now currently in what is referred to in strategic circles as the age of the Indo-Pacific. It is widely acknowledged that the center of gravity of international politics has shifted from the Euro-Atlantic area to what is commonly referred to as the Indo-Pacific. One of the primary reasons for that is that this is the most dynamically growing region, economically speaking. But also it reflects the shifts in relative power between various countries, the emergence of new centers of power in the Asia-Pacific and the Indo-Pacific region have necessitated countries everywhere to adopt more active engagement with this geographical region. And India, of course, being historically, geographically, and civilizationally a part of this region, is obviously going to be very deeply involved in this process of reimagining, if you will, the strategic geography of the Indo-Pacific. So we began somewhat slowly, admittedly, in the 90s as our economy began to open up. And it may not be widely known in the Philippines, but India in dollar terms is now the world's 5th largest economy. And we are well positioned to be, in less than a decade, the world's 3rd largest economy. And we hope that we will be able to sustain, despite the recent reverses, the very solid economic trajectory that the country and the society have established over the past 3 decades in particular. So as we began a process of economic revitalization and reform in India, it was very evident that ASEAN, which had moved ahead faster in that process, was going to be a logical partner for India. And so in the 1990s, we began a process of structured engagement with ASEAN. And that process was in 2012 elevated to the highest level of strategic partnership for ASEAN. So India became ASEAN's strategic dialogue partner in 2012. So next year we'll be completing 10 years of strategic dialogue. This means that we discuss every matter of interest for ASEAN and for India at the highest levels of our political leadership. And just in 2018, we commemorated 25 years of India-ASEAN dialogue with a major summit in India, which we were also delighted to welcome His Excellency President Duterte at that commemorative summit. So we do have a very well-established dialogue mechanism. We have structures and processes in place to engage each other. At the same time, India's relationships with other countries in this region, particularly I would mention Japan as an important partner, but also to a large extent, the United States as a Pacific power, and our bilateral relationships with the United States and Japan in particular have moved quite rapidly ahead. We also have strong engagement with China, with the Republic of Korea, with Australia, and other countries in the region. So what we are seeing is a broad-based engagement to the east of India, which encompasses some very collaborative partnerships, but in some cases also somewhat competitive partnerships with elements of conflict. And I think you know what I'm referring to in that context. So what we see is that we have this strong dialogue partnership with ASEAN, a very strong engagement with ASEAN, but at the same time, a broader rediscovery of India's relationships to its east. And this is perhaps the most consequential geographical region for Indian foreign policy at the current moment. So I want to start by basically laying out this larger canvas. Among other things, the fundamental objectives of Indian foreign policy is to ensure a peaceful and enabling environment for the broad-based social and economic development of India. And we believe that this development process is already well underway, but can be strengthened by having a stronger engagement with all the countries I mentioned as part of this region. Of course, this doesn't mean that our relationships to our west, perhaps relationships in the Gulf or with Europe or Africa or even Latin America, any less salient, but clearly in terms of prioritization, there's been a very strong prioritization of our East policy. That's why we moved from what we called in the 1990s a Look East policy to, for the past 6 or 7 years, we have been pursuing an upgraded version of the Look East policy, which is called the Act East policy. And while the Look East policy prioritized economic and commercial engagement, Act East continues to prioritize economic trade and investment ties, but Act East also ventures to build more consequential security and defense, as well as connectivity partnerships with the region. So we want to be more connected, more available, and more able to address security challenges together. So that's one of the fundamental elements of our Act East policy. So the two, if you will, the two pillars of our policy towards the region are a stronger economic engagement and a broad-based security partnership. Let me perhaps give you a certain sense of what we mean by connectivity and security partnerships, because economic partnership has been talked about and it remains a central element. But what is new in recent years, and especially after the, I would say, the tsunami of late 2004, was perhaps a turning point, because it brought home to a lot of people in India and the region the connectedness of our geographies and the need for us to build capacities in addressing non-traditional security threats like natural disasters. So we do have a greater focus on humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and we will continue to prioritize that element in our engagement here. The other element which has become very prominent recently is the blue economy. And this has, again, developmental as well as security elements. Maritime security is very important, as we have seen developments in the oceans surrounding the Philippines. Now, we do feel that broader national capacities built together and working together will help us address both traditional as well as non-traditional security challenges. So there's one very specific maritime security focus in the Blue Economy Dialogue, but also, as the Prime Minister mentioned, he has a concept, Prime Minister Modi has enunciated a concept of Sagar, which means ocean in Sanskrit. And it translates to an acronym which is security and growth for all in the region. So the way India sees it is that security and growth are two sides of the same coin. Without security, growth cannot be sustained. And as we grow, we will need to continue to work together on issues that threaten that growth. Let me also maybe say just a quick comment, since we are talking about India and the region, that the Philippines has become an increasingly important element of this partnership. We do have a very strong political dialogue that goes back many years. We've had very regular high-level interactions, especially over the past few years. We've witnessed more dialogue at the highest levels. But what is interesting is that we have managed to impart a lot of dynamism into our economic partnership, especially over the recent past. We are currently talking about the possibility of a preferential trade agreement. We've opened a new financial dialogue. We are discussing the possibility of Indian concessional funding for large infrastructure projects. We have commenced a very significant and serious dialogue on agriculture, especially focusing on uses of technology to modernize agricultural practices. And of course, there has been a traditional focus on pharmaceuticals and the IT sector, especially IT-enabled services. So there's a very rounded, a very dynamic relationship with the Philippines is a central element of India's Act East policy. So I have a few more points I'd like to mention, but I don't want this to be a monologue. So I'm going to maybe pause here. But since we are speaking, I am addressing a bunch of youngsters. Let me just make a few broader points, just so that I can, maybe trigger a discussion beyond the specifics. And firstly, I think it is very fair to say that the world of tomorrow is likely to be very different from what we faced yesterday or what it is today. Secondly, and unfortunately, we are faced with multiple crises. Climate change is particularly serious, but we do also have, for the first time, I think, trends suggesting that conflict between countries is becoming increasingly possible. And it's very important that we work together proactively if we are to ensure that the 21st century does not look like more of the 20th century, because in the 20th century too, we had new powers emerging and that didn't end very well. So all of you who are in the world of international relations and strategy and international politics need to keep in mind the imperative need. And I'm very delighted that the Miriam College has a Center for Peace Studies and that Mahatma Gandhi's bust there is a living testament to the connectivity that we have as societies, because both India and the Philippines have always placed a very strong priority on peace. So in the international context now, peaceful solution of disputes has become extremely important. The third thing is that we will not be able to achieve the outcomes that we want, both in development and in terms of peace, unless we can build new structures and processes. And obviously, as developing countries that are largely excluded from the decision-making processes, India and the Philippines have to work together to ensure better representation of our countries and our voices in larger issues internationally, but also in terms of regional decision-making. The other point is that a lot of issues require global solutions. I mentioned climate change. We're now going through the pandemic. We have the pernicious menace of terrorism. We have continuing poverty and inequality in various parts of the world. And of course, new technologies such as cyber and digital technologies, while bringing the world together, also have the potential to be very disruptive. So all of these elements require us to work together as countries to go beyond very national positions. And the last point I'd like to say is that state behavior will matter. Individual state behavior will matter. especially behavior by the bigger powers. The more power you have, the more you need to behave in a manner that is in accordance with the rules, and you need to accept that smaller countries also have legitimate interests. And as a big country surrounded by many small countries in South Asia, India's neighborhood first policy seeks to achieve that balance. We like to work in a manner in which we don't want to push our smaller neighbors into making uncomfortable choices. We don't make unjustified territorial demands or other claims on our smaller neighbors. We've in fact prioritized consensual decision-making and problem solving. And so this will be another important element of the emerging international system. And we need to work together, both India and the Philippines and other like-minded countries, to ensure that the larger countries behave in a manner in which it's consistent with the larger requirement of working together as a global community, as a regional community. Trust is at a premium. Trust has been eroded, and it is incumbent on the bigger countries to rebuild that trust. So I'm going to leave my thoughts there with those larger comments. I'd be very happy to hear from some of the younger participants in this discussion, but also from you, Professor Pitlo, and all others, anybody who wants to have a discussion. So thank you. I hope I haven't overstepped my time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ambassador Kumaran, for those very insightful remarks. Again, just to remind the participants and the audience, this conversation is being recorded. We are also presently live streaming at YouTube. And for your questions, you can post it in the chat box, or you can raise the questions personally. Just raise your hand. And so going back to the points, plenty of good points raised by Ambassador Kumaran. India is certainly a very significant player in the region. There's a lot of talk, as you mentioned, about the rise of India and its economic potential, of course, and of course, not to mention its enormous contribution to, of course, as the biggest producer of vaccines in the world. And so there's a lot of hope and expectations that India will soon, of course, do more to contribute also, as your country had been doing for a long time, to the cause of developing countries who have very weak public health capacity. So it's very interesting to have a country which is a member of Quad and BRICS at the same time. And we know that in these days, the growing polarization between, the increasing great power rivalry between the United States and China, and India is just close by. And but at the same time, of course, we have been hearing talk about India being caught out or being put in the loop to try to contain or push back against Chinese incursions or Chinese attempts to undermine the order. But of course, the Quad meeting had just been early this year. But at the same time, I think BRICS, India is also playing host for the 13th BRICS Summit. And recently, of course, India and Russia has also been at the highest level, continuing the conversation. And on the part of the Philippines, of course, one of the big ticket items that we're actively seeking, of course, is the BrahMos missiles that is co-developed by both India and Russia. So, all of this goes to show how India is deftly and, very cleverly working with everyone in an inclusive fashion. And again, these days, that requires a lot of difficult conversations at times. So we had a question posted by Ambassador Lula del Rosario. How does India see China's threats and actions in the South China Sea? The European navies have started to visit the area. UK in high fashion gear had announced that it would go to the region. Uh, so will India show some kind of support for this kind of activities, this freedom of navigation?
Well, thank you for that question. I believe that our relationship with China, India's relationship with China, is widely appreciated in the Philippines. And while we do have a very strong economic relationship, China is one of our largest trading partners, and we do have an ongoing dialogue on various economic issues, in particular looking at market access in China, because we do run a very large trade deficit, an unsustainable trade deficit with China, and that discussion is ongoing. And some of you may have noticed that we have been a little reluctant to enter into further trade arrangements without addressing fundamental issues relating to deficits and market access. And we do not believe that it is fair or equitable for one country to benefit much more than, and to have, in some sectors, very negative impacts on the livelihoods in our own domestic economy. So we are adopting a more cautious and a more deliberate approach, but we would really like to have more open trade, but at the same time, we'd like to have that in a manner in which it benefits both sides. So moving out of the economic relationship, we do have elements of the India-China relationship that require management, that require to be addressed more effectively. As some of you may be aware, we had a conflict with the Chinese in the early 60s, in 1962, after which we had a degraded relationship for nearly 25 years. And it was only in 1988 that we re-established contacts at the highest political level. Underlying that re-establishment of contacts was a recognition that while we work on the difficult issues relating to the border, we could make progress on the larger relationship. And we have made progress on the larger relationship. However, that did not imply and does not imply that there can be actions on the border that are so destabilizing, and those will be ignored. So what we found is that actions by China in the spring and summer last year have destabilized and made the overall context of further development of India-China relations uncertain. And we have been very clear in our bilateral dialogue with our Chinese colleagues and counterparts that there is a need to address this issue expeditiously. We continue that dialogue and we remain engaged towards achieving a satisfactory outcome. But at this point of time, it is fair to say that what has happened has had a fairly deep impact on the trajectory of growth of the India-China relationship, and it will require some major moves from the Chinese side to repair the damage. And we do see a certain pattern of behavior which has certain commonalities with what is obtaining in your own immediate neighborhood in the Philippines. Efforts to create new facts on the ground. Efforts to highlight sovereignty concerns, but at the same time disregard the sovereignty concerns of the other side. So in some way, the idea is that because I am more powerful and more influential, my security concerns have to be taken on board, and that your security concerns and your sovereignty concerns are a subject of discussion. So this clearly is not a productive approach. The third element that we see is that there's an effort to try and coerce and to create situations which, in the India-China border, unfortunately, we've seen violence which we hadn't seen for several decades. And there is potential for similar outcomes in this in the maritime domain as well. And we do hope that it will not lead to that. But the behavior patterns are quite similar. So we do have ongoing discussions with various interlocutors on the Philippine side to sensitize them about our approaches. And of course, India has been very firm and very robust in defending our interests. And we do encourage all countries, including smaller countries, to adopt similar robust approaches to defending their interests and their sovereignty and security concerns. And that's why we would like to work more strongly with our partners in the region in building capacity. And we do look at our broader partnership in the security domain and defense domain as contributing to more stability in this region. So we do want to countervail what I would describe as destabilizing actions with greater capacity on the part of our ASEAN partners, for instance. And in that context, definitely there's also an effort to work with other like-minded countries and to have broader structures of support. So we welcome the role that the United States continues to play. We welcome the increased role of Japan and Australia. And of course, you mentioned that there is an effort under Quad to build more capacity in the broader sense. So the answer to Ambassador Del Rosario's question is we do recognize what is happening on the South China Sea, but our approach to China is our relationship with China on the bilateral side is so heavily loaded, and we have our own processes and engagement. And while we are fully aware of what is happening here, and as I mentioned, we do notice the similarities, and we do have a quiet discussion with our partners. Our current approach is not to adopt a publicly activist position. We will work in a determined and quiet manner with our partners in the region to ensure that our shared interests are protected.
Thank you, Ambassador Kumaran. So we got another question. This is in relation to the ongoing global health crisis. As we know, the cases in India, unfortunately, in recent weeks had surged. And as you said, this goes to show how unpredictable this invisible enemy is. I think this scourge is not only affecting other countries which in the past had been more insulated. Other countries in Europe, even countries that had also announced victory or triumph over the virus in East Asia, like Taiwan, even Singapore and Vietnam, had also seen a resurgence. I understand that in the past, Bharat Biotech was among the manufacturers that the Philippines is eyeing at. So one of the suppliers. Again, this is a very precious commodity these days. And of course, we understand that India would now have to refocus to meet domestic demand. But of course, if things improve, there's a lot of expectation and there's hope that India can once again fill in the void. Ambassador, I'm sure you know that many developing countries are experiencing this inequity in terms of accessing this COVID-19 vaccines. You have the phenomenon of many countries oversubscribing their purchases and leaving very little for poor countries in the global south. So we hope to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, a few points. Firstly, yes, you're right. There has been a reprioritization in the view of in light of the surge in India. But the reprioritization is not merely oriented towards India. And I think that, as I said, as we are able to cap and then roll back the situation and our vaccination numbers are reach an adequate level, India will be a partner for like-minded countries such as the Philippines. So I don't see this as a process of uh, where we are not able to supply for a very prolonged period of time. We are increasing our numbers very rapidly, production capacities. And we have already reached to close to 200 million people vaccinated with the first dose and nearly 40 million with 2 doses. So we are moving ahead quite rapidly with our vaccination program. And I do hope that Bharat, which has got the emergency use authorization in the Philippines, will be able to start its supplies in the not too distant future to the Philippines and also to many other countries. You also know that Secretary Galvez had visited the Serum Institute, the largest manufacturer of vaccines in India. And there is a contract for about 30 million doses of the Novavax vaccine, which is a US developed vaccine, which will be manufactured in India. So there's also a program under Quad to generate some vaccine manufacturing capacity. And a large part of that production capacity is envisaged to be created in India. And as we assume currently, the vaccine requirements will spread well into 2022 and perhaps even later with booster doses, etc., required. So we do see this as a process wherein we would like to be and we would work hard to be a very reliable partner for the Philippines in the future. And I'm confident that we will be. With regard to the issues around vaccine equity, as you know, India has been supplying vaccines even as we were inoculating our countrymen and women. And we've been actively spearheading in the WTO movement to try and waive the intellectual property rights so that more and easier manufacturing and cheaper manufacturing can happen of products that are related to the COVID, including vaccines, but also therapeutics. And we do hope that with the United States having expressed its support, and recently even the European Parliament coming out in support, we do believe that there is critical momentum building up. The other element of vaccine equity for India in particular is the issue of raw materials. We've had some shortages, and we are engaged with partners to ensure that the raw materials continue to be A, available, B, predictable, and C, affordable, so that we can continue to provide the vaccines that the world needs in the near future. Lastly, we would like to work with countries in the medium to long term to create, in partnership, vaccine manufacturing and vaccine-related capacities in various countries. So we don't see, definitely India's world view is that the world is one family, and especially in a time of illness and health requirements, we should work together. And I am confident that like we've done with generic drugs, where we've made life-saving medication available to countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, on vaccines too, India will be a major partner, an affordable, trusted vaccine manufacturer for our partners.
Thank you for those very good news. We hope to, of course, those statements bore fruit, and we hope again that we welcome the support of India in this global fight against this pandemic. So we have a question about the Indian Ocean, the security. Of course, in recent years, Indian Ocean littoral states have been trying to exact the most concessions, playing off India against China, um, trying to court investments and at the same time security aid. from both India, the traditional regional power, and China, who's increasing its presence around the Indian Ocean, which is very critical for, of course, the sea lanes of communication and global trade. Every election um, in recent years has become very keenly watched, not only domestically, but also by major powers like India and China. So, what is your take about this developing dynamics in the Indian Ocean region? That, of course, would have far-reaching implications to Indian security.
As you rightly said, India has a very vital position in the Indian Ocean region. And we've been traditionally very strongly engaged with a lot of our partners in our extended neighborhood. And this includes the Gulf region, where a lot of our energy supplies come. And we do have several millions of Indians who work in the Gulf, and they're a big source of remittances. So this region has very great importance for India. And going beyond that into Africa, where we had in the east coast of Africa, traditionally very strong in connections, the Indian communities all the way from Kenya to South Africa, and including in the island communities, whether it's Mauritius, Seychelles, etc. Very large presence of the Indian diaspora there. So we've traditionally built very strong partnerships in that region. On the East Coast, with the new structures that have been created, we mentioned about India ASEAN. We spoke about the India's Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, and we do also have other mechanisms such as BIMSTEC, which is Bangladesh, India, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Thailand economic cooperation. So these mechanisms are giving us the capacity to be able to coordinate and cooperate in terms of the maritime interests that we have. We do notice that there are countries which are seeking to enhance their presence in the Indian Ocean. We appreciate that as countries grow larger, they do have interests that stretch beyond their immediate boundaries. But we would really hope that it is done in a manner in which it enhances collaborative security rather than detracts from it. We would be cautious about introducing, greater elements of military engagement. While recognizing that countries have interests, I think we should be responsible in the manner in which we seek to secure those interests. And the way India wants to work is to build partnerships and enhance capacities, enhance the ability to work together to address challenges. So it's a slightly, perhaps, a different model to what some of the other new entrants in the Indian Ocean are pursuing.
Thank you, Ambassador. So next year, there's a lot of expectation that the regional comprehensive economic partnership, considered the largest free trade agreement in the world, driven largely by ASEAN and its dialogue partners, will take effect. And we understand that India initially declined for the time being to join. Do you think there would be a possible change in attitude of India in this regard, knowing that some economists are saying that free trade agreements can help kickstart economic recovery from this recession brought about by the pandemic? So your thoughts on it, Ambassador?
India has always grown faster when it's adopted open and dynamic economic policies. We are strongly committed to globalization, and we would like to seek all opportunities to broaden our engagement. And it is in that context that we were actively participating within RCEP. But as I mentioned, we do also have serious concerns at the way in which the trade agreements are being implemented. We do find, for instance, Indian pharmaceutical products have found acceptance in most parts of the world. But in some of the markets in East Asia, we find that that is not the case. And so therefore, we do believe that there is a need for a broader approach to trade, which prioritizes the interests of all sides. And we do not want to be part of a process that could further exacerbate the existing disparities. So we'd like to have a more considered approach towards trade arrangements such as RCEP. So that is the context in which India has not decided to continue with its engagement of RCEP. I don't see a re-examination of that position in the near future. At the same time, we've been opening a lot of discussions with the India-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement. We would like to have an active review of that and to see where the bottlenecks are. We also have agreements with Japan and with South Korea, and we do have ongoing negotiations with the European Union, which we just recommenced after nearly a 7-8 year gap. And we are having a strong discussion with the United States on a liberalized trading arrangements between our countries. So we are very strongly committed to improving our linkages with our partners in trade and investment. But we would like to really see this process benefit people in terms of livelihoods. India has still a very long way to go in terms of development of its broader population. And we do not want to be part of a process that can continue to, which threatens to deindustrialize segments of our economy. So we would, obviously each country has to make its own choice, but we would really like to work with our partners to see and to highlight the potential for win-win growth in the broad sense, not as a slogan, and then it is only win for one person. So that's the perspective that we currently have. We want to have stronger trade ties and investment ties, but in a balanced manner.
Thank you for that. So we have a question about the current disputes for the Philippines and China, among other claimants in the South China Sea. In recent weeks and months, of course, there's the huge presence of Chinese vessels in our exclusive economic zone. And there had been the past incidents that affected our efforts to harness our living and non-living marine resources in this very critical and strategic maritime space. Of course, India and China also share a very storied, flashpoint along the Himalayas, and it appears that India and China did have some very difficult phases in the course of managing their disputes. So we're hoping to hear ambassadors, curious students studying foreign relations, any lessons that India can possibly share to the Philippines in handling this very difficult part of bilateral relations with a very powerful, assertive northern neighbor. Your thoughts,
as
sir.
I mentioned earlier, I think there are very, very evident similarities. One is that, as I mentioned, new facts are sought to be created on the ground, and then negotiations start from that point, and that doesn't work. Secondly, your sovereignty is not more important than my sovereignty. I think both countries that are involved, each of them have issues of sovereignty and access to resources, and they need to be respected. Thirdly, I don't think intimidation and coercion is helpful, because that, and when we are faced with that, our response is to resist, and resist very actively. And we do acknowledge that there may be limitations to that approach, and sometimes we've had a situation like we've had in the in the Himalayan frontier, but we do not intend to budge from that approach. We will continue to be very, very stubborn in defending our legitimate interests. Fourthly, building on that, I think we would like to prioritize peaceful resolution. And that is why we've been ready always to have a dialogue. We continue to have a dialogue on various issues, including currently there's a whole dialogue process going on between India and China. So we leave the path open for dialogue. But at the same time, we will not be intimidated or we will not accept new facts that have been created on the ground. I think that's what the bottom line for India is, and that's what our message is for our friends in the region.
I'm still receiving a flood of questions, but we do not want to abuse the generosity of the good ambassador. We understand your everyday tight schedule. So at this point, allow me to
maybe you can club 2 or 3 questions, and then I can have a last round of it.
Okay. Hold on. So there's this question about the business process outsourcing and the tech industry in India, which may have, of course, also linked with that of the Philippines. And it may be one area where Philippines and India can collaborate and expand cooperation for mutual benefit. And so, but at the same time, there's also a competitive element in that. So your thoughts on that, Ambassador?
So that's a very important question, actually. And for India, this sector is very, very critical because we are really looking at a sector that is somewhere between $200 to $300 billion in value. And I think the element of competition is perhaps a little overstated in the case of the Philippines. I don't see a direct competitive approach between India and the Philippines. I'd like to see, like what we've done with the BPOs, we've had a lot of Indian investments in the Philippines, and Indian companies have opened operations here and are doing quite well. So I think that there is scope for us to work collaboratively. India brings something to the table, Philippines brings something else to the table, and we are able to service the global market. And that's, at the end of the day, the market will guide how business develops. And I think that the prospects here for India and the Philippines are very positive. We would like to work with the Philippines in areas that are higher up the value chain. And we do recognize that the Philippines is also prioritizing some of those issues. The DTI recently published an artificial intelligence roadmap. On the digital economy, essentially the approach is to build domestic capacities, obviously in India, education and reskilling, upskilling is part of the process. And I do see that the Philippines can also benefit from a strong partnership with the Indian IT sector. I remember Ambassador Del Rosario, during her time in India, she had encouraged many of the Indian companies to come into the Philippines. And she'll be very happy to see now that many of them are doing very well. And currently, Indian companies employ more than 150,000 Filipinos, and those numbers are going up. And I personally would like to see more collaborative activities. And we are quite willing and open to having that.
Thank you, Ambassador. Certainly, it's a very welcome development to see more Indian companies investing in the Philippines, in the BPO. We hope to see more such investments in other areas as well. I think Philippines, along with other fellow ASEAN members, are active parts in this regional and global value production chain. Of course, we see in recent years the emerging dispersal of foreign capital away from certain markets and moving into new markets like in South Asia and in Southeast Asia for probably trade and for economic and non-economic reasons. but certainly it's something that we in the Philippines welcome. And so this morning we have covered a wide range of
There's one
topics.
question to me from Aaron Judd Rabena, where he says, which among the ASEAN countries does India have the closest or most advanced relations? What
Please,
can
sir.
India ties learn from it? Maybe I can close with that answer, because I think bottom line for me is the India-Philippines relationship. It is located in the broader construct of India and ASEAN and the Indo-Pacific. But I think India-Philippines relations have a dynamic of their own. Somewhere I think the fact that the Philippines is one of the largest countries in the world with a population of over 110 million, with an extremely skilled population and a diaspora that, a lot of workers across the world. And I was really struck by the similarities that we have as countries. When I came in here a few months ago, we are both very vibrant democracies. We are very young in demographic terms. Both our countries are very young. We have very globalized diasporas which are actively involved, and that creates a natural momentum for us to look to international relations and to manage those relationships actively. So definitely the Philippines is a very, very critical and important partner for India. In terms of comparisons, of course, our trade relationship is quite small, because countries such as Indonesia, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam, and Malaysia have bilateral trade with India is in the double digits. Philippines-India trade is still quite low. In terms of large investments also, I believe that Indian companies haven't come into the Philippines in a big way. There may be issues around the way in which investments are permitted and managed in the Philippines that are attributable to that. We are working with your government on, as I said, some large infrastructure projects have been completed with Indian investment. I specifically refer to the Cebu airport, and the same Indian companies also built the terminal for the Clark airport. But we could look at cooperation on a variety of other areas, including railways and perhaps even in terms of IT infrastructure and national broadband networks, etc. So there is potential in this relationship. On the economic scale, we need to have more dialogue, more visits of delegations, better exposure between our business communities. And I'm very happy to inform you that in the past few months, the embassy has focused its attention in doing exactly that. We have connected our business communities better. Of course, it's still slow, especially because of COVID, but there have been a lot of virtual dialogues, and in a sense, digitalization and the digital virtual conferencing has helped us to build those networks. And maybe once things open up, we have completed a new air services agreement. We have initiated connections between one Indian airline and Philippine Airlines. It's a very tough time for the aviation industry, but we do believe that with a slight revival, we can look at direct aviation links between India and the Philippines. So one of the critical enablers for Thailand or Singapore or Malaysia is the fact that there are direct air connectivity between India and those countries. And I think we should really strive to build that connectivity with the Philippines. And there are a lot of areas, I don't want to detail all of it, but let me just say that currently the Philippines is not among the leading partners in ASEAN, but I feel that with some work and prioritization from both sides, this can be a comparable relationship to those in other ASEAN countries, India's relationship with other ASEAN countries.
Thank you, Ambassador. We are very certain that you at the HEM, India's top envoy in this country, our trade, economic, and overall relations would continue to blossom. And we would be very thankful for your service, for improving relations between us and your home country, India. So this morning, on the subject of India's foreign relations, its economic and security policy. We have covered much ground from security defense. We have talked about the similarities and the parallels between Philippines and India, which make them a very good complementary partners and friends. Uh, we have seen some experiences. We have heard Ambassador shared with us some lessons about managing disputes with which India and Philippines also have with some neighbors. And the ending part about the prospects for Philippines-India relations is, I'm sure that would leave a very good impression and expectation also for, especially for our young audience this morning. So uh, thank you, Ambassador Del Rosario, for inviting me to host this discussion with our very good Ambassador Kumaran, my colleague, Dr. Ravena, uh, and the rest of the staff of Miriam College. Please watch out for the next programs of Miriam College, which would be posted on their social media page and on their website. Uh, Ambassador Del Rosario may want to have some
Yeah.
final words.
Yeah. Okay. I just want to thank the ambassador for really drawing attention to the similarities between India and Vietnam. You know, the diaspora, the democratic element. We are India is the largest democracy in the world. Some people don't realize that. They think it's the US. It's India with more than 1 billion people. And of course, our democracies are both rambunctious. I think you know that. When I was in India, I thought I said, which is more exciting. I get excited also about their democracy, the way I'm sure the ambassador understands what we're going through. But there's something also interesting because of our diaspora. There are more Indian Filipino marriages. I think, if you go to India, you'll see them. And I think even here, you'll see more of the Indians really intermarrying with our people. And also we see many of them here really putting up small businesses. So Ambassador, thank you. Thank you very much for giving us your time and for enriching our diplomatic hour. And I'm glad that we were able to have you today. Okay, Danyabad.
You. And I think if I may just request some of those who are there to open up their screens, and maybe we can take a quick a picture for our social media feed for the embassy.
Yeah, okay,
Uh,
thank you.
Kindly open your screen. So for the documentation purposes of the Indian Embassy and for posterity's sake, Ambassador, you can make 3 clicks or as many clicks as you wish.
Yeah, my colleague Vishwanjali is probably a photographer for this morning.
Yeah. We're also streaming on our YouTube channel, Ambassador, just so you know. There are those whom we do not see.
I'm really grateful for this opportunity to meet so many young people. And
Yeah.
you're very right. I mean, including, I believe, the new Philippines contestant for Miss Universe is a joint India.
Yeah, it's a joint effort. Yeah, I'm talking about that too. She's not the first one. We had Venus Raj, I think about 10 years ago.
I know,
Yeah.
some years ago.
Yeah. The one I want to request from you, please open up more Indian restaurants. I mean, some people really have to be introduced to the Indian dosa, not just the samosa. The dosa really is heavenly. Yeah.
I think there's some misconceptions around Indian food here because it's kind of difficult to speak about Indian food because, as you would imagine, a country of 1.3 billion with 3,000 plus languages, we obviously have a lot of diversity in food as
Yeah.
well. So you can, it's not all spicy and difficult to eat. So I encourage all the youngsters to check out their neighboring restaurant and obviously have as Ambassador says,
Yeah.
have
Maybe
an,
when we can have the face-to-face possibility, let's have an Indian food festival at Miriam College. We'll
sounds like a good idea. We wholeheartedly commit to that, and we will do that. We'll do an India Day for you with some cultural shows and things, so we can have a fun.
That's going to be a lot of cuisine, Ambassador.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
which cuisine are you gonna bring?
We will try and bring as much variety as we can. We will do that.
I like the one from Calcutta also. I like, yeah. Mm. Okay. So thank you.
Thank you
And
very
all
much,
those who
all of you, and
attended.
namaste. Stay well. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. And
Thank
to
you,
everyone,
Ambassador.
those
Thank you,
who joined
Ambassador.
us today, thank you very much. Those from Miriam College and elsewhere. Good day. Have a nice